Final lecture on The Great Divorce. One of my favorite books. It's heavy. It's heavy. It's heavy. There's a lot. So I do, even though this is the final lecture and we're wrapping it up, please hear me say, go back to this book again. Next year, next month, in 5 years, in 10 years. I mean, this is probably my eighth or ninth time going through it, and I'm getting more and more every time, right? So I'm barely scraping the surface. So understand that as we wrap it up, we're really barely scraping the surface. But to start, I want to go back to this verse in 1 Corinthians. It's 1 Corinthians 13:12. And Paul says this. He says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." And so this is just a reiteration, another way of saying the same thing we keep saying is that we see reflections, we don't yet see the reality. We see glimmers, we don't see the full picture. We see leaves, we don't see the tree or the full backcountry. And so I really want to hone in on that, hone in on our own limited sight, yet a limited sight that gives us glimpses of something bigger than ourselves. And so what we're going to focus on for this last lecture is time and eternity, the relationship between the two, and what we can understand with our glimpses, and then the relationship between reflections and reality. And what you guys need to do is wherever in your book you have the theme list that we've kind of been crafting as we've gone through, I want you to flip there, because the way I'm going to do this is just go through a couple of themes that I want y'all to add to that list, and then we'll have the unit takeaway, and we'll call it a day and call it a book. So first theme to add to that list, wherever you have it in your book, is that as long as there is free will, we can choose evil. As long as there is free will, we can choose evil. We can choose the wrong choice. And the question that naturally comes up is, well, I wish I didn't have free will, right? Why doesn't God just take away free will and make sure that we just all do the right thing? And if you go down that path, what that means now is that we're not created in the image of God, because God is a God of freedom and God is a God of choice. And as his image bearers, he imparts that into us. And so if we say there's no free will, then we're not actually God's image bearers, and that's not a place I want to go. And George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis says, well, if we can always choose evil, how is it okay that even one person goes to hell? How can God still be good if even one person is damned to hell? And that's a really tough question, and I think one that we've probably all thought of, and all the church fathers have wrestled with too, right? It's nothing new, but it's still not easy. And George MacDonald, he answers it in a couple ways, but the one that I'm looking at is he says, "The day must come when joy prevails and all the makers of misery are no longer able to infect it." And so essentially what he's saying here is that if one person, me, if I could choose darkness, and because I choose darkness and choose hell, that God is no longer good, then light is actually no stronger than darkness. That darkness actually has control over light by being able to blackmail it in a way, right? If I can choose evil, and because of my choice, darkness or light is now subject to the dark, that's not how it works, right? Because over all shadows rise the sun, right? Light is clearly a stronger power than darkness. And so what George MacDonald says here is he says, the day must come when joy, when light prevails, and all the makers of misery, the lovers of darkness, are no longer able to infect it, right? Light will predominate, just like after every night there is a morning. And there's a lot we can read into here, but I think what we need to see is that ultimately the sun will ride over all the shadows. But as long as there is free will, as God's image bearers, we can choose the shadows, just like so many of the ghosts have chosen as we've gone throughout. Next theme, hell compared to heaven is nearly invisible. Now, don't get too caught up in the maybe the literalness of this statement, but in the story, C.S. Lewis says, where was that cliff that we rose up and, that I flew up from hell or from the gray town into heaven? Where is that? And C.S. Lewis or George MacDonald plucks a little blade of grass and like points this little tiny speck of dirt, this little tiny crack in the soil. He goes, oh, it's about that size. And C.S. Lewis is like, what are you talking about? Like, it was huge. I was sitting in a bus. And he says, well, comparatively, compared to how real and how solid heaven is, everything else is just minuscule. And he says this, he says, all loneliness, angers, hatreds, envies, and itchings that hell contains, if rolled into one single experience and put into the scale against the least amount of the joy that is felt by the least person of heaven, it would have no weight that could be registered at all. It's a beautiful picture of if you took everything, if you took everything in hell, everything on earth, and weighed it against the smallest bit of joy in heaven, of real joy in heaven, you wouldn't even be able to see the world, right? The smallest bit of joy in heaven is going to be that much more vast and whole and real and complete than all the reflections that we see, right? The light is going to be infinitely more powerful than all of the reflections that we see. And so the way C.S. Lewis communicates that in his story is that hell is literally a speck of dust compared to the full backcountry of heaven. That earth is really a speck of dust compared to the full backcountry of heaven. So hell compared to heaven is nearly invisible. Thirdly, another thing that we get in this section is that every lizard will become a horse if we submit. So I'm using the image of the ghost with the lizard, and he has to submit to it being killed, and then it is resurrected into a horse. And the key word is submit. I had a student who asked me, well, Mr. Harvey, how can I kill my lizard that's on my shoulder? And the answer really is you can't, right? If you'll notice, the ghost doesn't reach up there and grab the lizard and kill it himself. What he does is he submits to it being killed by someone greater than him. And so what George MacDonald says in response to that is he says that every disease that submits to a cure shall be cured. And that's the key word right here, right? Every disease that submits to a cure shall be cured. Our lust will become love. Our happiness will become joy. Our discontentment will become contentment. Our Zines up will be fulfilled. But it takes a submission, it takes a prayer of God, I want you to take this and I want you to kill it and I want you to resurrect it. And it's like the hero's journey. If you want the treasure, you have to descend into Hades before you get the treasure. You have to submit to death before you're able to live. And that's the case with every part of our lives has to be submitted. We have to say, I'd rather serve in heaven than reign in hell. And I'm submitting to this servitude. And then lastly, we see reflections. We don't see the reality yet. And this is where there's a confusing scene. He goes into this whole conversation I'm really interested in, but there's not enough time to really cover it well, about the relationship between time and eternity and the relationship between choice and God's foreknowledge and predestination, etc. But what George MacDonald tells us is he says, hey, we can't fully understand that because we see through the lens of time. And through the lens of time, all that we can see are small bits and pieces. He says it's like looking through the back end of a telescope, right? Where you can just see a little bit. You can just see a little bit. And you can move around and see little glimpses of it, but you can't see the full picture. And so he says, I don't want you to worry too much about the relationship between time and eternity. He says, for every attempt to see the shape of eternity except through the lens of time destroys your knowledge of freedom. So he says, if you start thinking too much about it, you'll think, oh, I'm not a free person. There's someone else governing every single move. And while there's some truth to that, he says we have to continue to see that we have the choice. What we need to focus on is the choice of heaven and hell. He says the choice is always before you, neither is closed. And so it's not a clean answer, right? It's not a clean answer of, okay, here's exactly how we can see through time, and yet there's still an eternal picture and a God outside of time who can see everything. It's not a clean answer, but I think it's an answer that is true and sufficient. True and sufficient. That what we need to understand is that we have freedom of choice, right? That we see reflections, we don't yet see the full picture, we don't see outside of time. And so to not get too caught up in, well, is predestination or free choice? Does God know if I'm about to raise my right hand or I'm about to raise my left hand? Oh, got you, God. Oh, he knew that, right? Like, I used to do that as a kid. I'd be like, okay, God's thinking I'm going to raise my right hand, raise my left, shoot. But he knew that, right? Now try and like go ahead. And George MacDonald's saying, stop that, right? What you need to know is that we are creatures made with free will, and that we have the choice to either choose to be content with the reflections or to pursue the reality, and trust that we will see the reality one day. Then there's this incredible scene with the chessboard. And C.S. Lewis says he got a glimpse of how life really was. And in this little vision he has, so he's having a dream, and it's a vision in his dream. So we're talking like some layers here, some inception. But he has this vision of this chessboard, which is time, right? Our lives on Earth, and there's these big like shapes, human shapes, looking down and watching people move around on the chessboard. And what it's supposed to represent is that we are eternal beings, right? So our souls, the eternal part of us, are these big giants standing around the chessboard, and we're looking down on our lives on Earth because we are also temporal beings, meaning we live inside of time. And so the paradox here is that our choices, right, the things that we do on the chessboard inside of time, are entirely free, entirely up to us, but they're also foreknown, right? The eternal part of us, the part that's outside of time, is going to look back and realize that there was something else at work. And again, we can't fully understand, but I really do think both of those are true. That we live inside of time as these chess pieces, making decisions, going forward, backward, left, right. And yet also we are eternal beings who have a soul that is outside of time. And there is a God who is outside of time, who is looking down and watching this. And this is a mystery, right? How both of those can be true, I think we'll understand one day, but not now. And it reminds me of Princess and the Goblin, where the grandmother says, you don't need to figure that out right now, right? What you need to figure out is that you have this choice. Submit and make the right choice. Lastly, do not settle for the reflection. Long for the reality. I could talk for another 30 minutes about this, as you guys know, right? The Sehnsucht is the glimpse that leads you to a longing. Don't settle for anything other than the full picture. To go back to that C.S. Lewis quote, for mere Christianity, if we find within ourselves a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world, right? So Sehnsucht is a spiritual homesickness. It's a feeling that you are not home, and it's just this longing to finally be home and to be whole. And there's two ways to approach that, right? Part one is, let's say you're homeless, right? We're homeless right now. We're not home. Option one is to keep looking for home, to keep hoping and longing and looking for a home that we trust is going to come. Option two is to say, well, I don't know 100% that home is going to come, so I'm going to learn to be content with homelessness. Right? I'm going to go back to the gray town and be content with being homeless. And so many people do that, and I think that's such a disaster. Right? Don't settle for the reflected light that we can see right now. Long for the full light, long for the reality, long to fully escape the cave one day. And that's the Sehnsucht. And at the end, what happens at the end is the light the sun finally rises. If we were to go back to that twilight diagram, the sun finally rises, and C.S. Lewis hears, it comes, sleepers awake. It comes, it comes, it comes. What a Zeinzluck line right there, right? Sleepers awake, the morning comes. And the way the story ends is interesting. The morning actually comes and he's caught as a ghost, right? It's like his death or the end times, and he was living in the wrong twilight, right? So it's almost like he missed it, right? Clearly, he's just depicting this as a dream, and he says he woke up and it was just books falling. So this is this dream that he had, but it's almost like he wakes up and realizes he wakes up from this dream in which he made the wrong choice, and now in the actual life of C.S. Lewis, he has the real choice, right? And he clearly chose to live in the twilight that turned into day. But in the story, it was a twilight, and he got caught, right? We don't want to get caught as a ghost when the sun rises. So here's, I guess, a unit takeaway. There's a fork in the road. Which road will you take? Here's some things I think are worth thinking about. Good and evil, heaven and hell, light and dark, however you want to put it, are a great divorce. To go back to what we talked about in the preface. You can't have the smallest bit of heaven and hell. You can't have the smallest bit of hell in heaven. Another way of saying that is you cannot keep the reflection and the reality, right? Either choose to be content with this little lizard on your shoulder, or submit it, kill it, and it will become a horse, right? We are discontent, and everything that we desire will come to fruition when we see the full reality. But we have to submit the reflection. We have to say, I'm okay with not seeing the full picture. And I don't want the little bits that I can see, because I want the full picture. Our choice is to reign in hell or serve in heaven. Submit, right? Submit to servitude. Submit to spiritual homelessness, knowing that one day we will be home. And then I just want to end with this question: which twilight will you choose to live in? So going back to that twilight diagram, we're all living in a twilight. Is it a twilight fading to morning, or a twilight fading to night? And that's the choice that we currently have. So I'm going to show this on the last video when we wrap up the whole year, but just kind of cool to see the full board. We've been a long way, and I'm really, really proud of you guys.